Hello and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesday. I am Anna Schumann Gallegos, 3GNY board member and grandchild of two Holocaust survivors. It is my honor to welcome you to our 19th installment of WEDU Wednesday with our featured speaker, Szyja Kenigsztajn. We welcome all of you who are tuning in for the first time, as well as those of you who regularly participate in our programs. We are grateful for your continued support in this series. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. Founded in 2005 with a group of 6, 3GNY's membership is now at 4,800 and growing. We have held diverse programs of all sizes around the New York area and played a leading role in launching other 3G groups, including 3G DC, 3G NJ, and 3G Philly. Right now, we are currently working to facilitate the formation and growth of other 3G groups. Tonight's WEDU Wednesday program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, short for We Educate. 3Gs are often the last living link to survivors and their stories. There's currently a roster of over 300 of us that have gone through the WEDU speaker training program, and thanks to this past year's virtual classes, our 62 newest speakers come not only from New York, New Jersey, and DC, but all over the world. For me, and I'm sure for many of us who have gone through WEDU can relate to, those 4 weeks are more than just a speaker training program. When I stepped into that WEDU classroom in late 2018, I had never been in a room filled with only 3Gs before. I felt a camaraderie and a silent understanding that I'd never experienced. I was able to feel the full weight of my grandparents' stories while being supported by my peers when it started to feel a little bit overwhelming. I also felt hope that together we could make a difference. We learned how to paint a complete picture and turn a statistic, a number, back into a whole person that students can relate to. What their lives looked like before ghettos and death camps, how they saw things escalate from propaganda, graffiti, and what seemed like small isolated incidents, and how after seeing the worst of humanity, our grandparents inexplicably picked themselves up and tried to piece a life back together. I'm honored to be part of an initiative that is actively combating the statistics that show a staggering lack of Holocaust education by educating diverse communities about the perils of intolerance. Studies have shown that those that receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with those who are different from them. They are more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to become upstanders. 3GNY does not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free, and we aim to keep the cost of training to 3Gs as low as possible. You can help us through a financial gift of any amount. This will go directly towards training more speakers and reaching even more students. There's a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. If you've already donated, thank you so much. To everyone watching, just by tuning in today, you are helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just an empty phrase. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Jackie Van Doren, WEDU volunteer, who will share some remarks and introduce Szyja.
Thanks, Anna. As a descendant of 4 Holocaust survivors, 3GNY is a group that's extremely important to me. I'm inspired each and every time I hear a story from one of our speakers. And with that, I'm excited to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Szyja Kenigsztajn. I had the pleasure of getting to know Szyja as we both went through the WEDU program together last year, just before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Szyja was born and raised in Southern Maine and has been a volunteer for 3G WEDU since 2020. Growing up, Szyja always felt a strong connection to his family's experience during the Holocaust and wanted to share their stories as a way to combat persecution, racial injustice, and anti-Semitism. Szyja lives in Manhattan with his husband. He graduated from Boston University with a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations. He currently works at American Express in the Global Consumer Services Group. Szyja, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Good evening, and thank you for joining. My name is Szyja Kenigsztajn, and my paternal grandfather, Sewek Kingston, was a Holocaust survivor. Now, before I present my grandfather's story, I wanted to share why I tell his story specifically. Growing up, my grandfather wasn't very comfortable sharing his experiences and his stories of what happened in the Holocaust, especially with people outside of our family. When I was in 7th grade, we were given a school assignment. We were supposed to interview one of our grandparents to learn what life was like in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, juxtaposed to the 90s when I was growing up. When I got home that night, I knew I wanted to interview my grandfather. I thought maybe this could be the introduction where I could finally find out what exactly happened during the Holocaust. So when I went to ask him if I could interview him for my project, he looked at me with a very pained expression on his face, and he said, "Why would I want to tell such a sad story?" I knew looking at his reaction that I shouldn't push or try to convince him otherwise, so I let it go. In subsequent years, he did share stories. I would say it was common amongst our family to never ask about what happened, but once he did start sharing, we would all immediately stop what we were doing and listen and see what he had to say. Sadly, my grandfather passed in 2012, and I never did actually hear his full story, what he experienced from start to finish. I only had the few memories that he would share with us. After that, I contemplated whether or not I should share his story. I wasn't sure. I wanted to respect his wishes. I knew that it wasn't something that he was comfortable about speaking about, so I kind of kept it to myself. However, over the last 4 to 5 years, with increase of intolerance, anti-Semitism, racism, persecution, just hatred, I knew I wanted to do more than just donate to charities. I thought maybe I could use my family story and the trauma that they experienced to educate others. And I'm so thankful for 3GNY and the WEDU program, because they gave me the tools to put together those stories that I had heard growing up into a cohesive narrative and tell it in a way that I think my grandfather would have if he were comfortable sharing his story. And with that, I'm going to present Sewek Kingston's story. My grandfather was born Szyja Kenigsztajn on May 10th, 1921, in a city called Piotrkow Trybunalski in Poland. This past Monday actually would have been his 100th birthday. Piotrkow was a historical and culturally significant city, both to Poles and Jews. It's believed to be one of the oldest Jewish communities in Poland, with an active Jewish community dating back to the 16th century. When my grandfather was born, about 1/3 of the city was Jewish. He was very interested in sports growing up. He played on a city soccer league. He went to public school. I will say back then in Poland, the schools were segregated. So there were 2 school systems in Piotrkow. One for Jewish students, where they were educated mostly in Yiddish. They did learn Polish language and literature and history as well. And then another school system for Polish students. My grandfather was the 3rd out of 4 children. His parents were Haskell and Gitla. His father Haskell worked at a family bakery owned by his father, and his mother Gitla was a homemaker. He had an older brother named Strulik, an older sister named Hanna, and a younger sister named Franka. They were an observant family. They went to synagogue on Friday nights, kept a kosher kitchen, but they weren't what we would consider Orthodox and lived a more secular lifestyle. They were a very typical family. They took family portraits just like we do today. They were patriots and proud to be Polish citizens. In the summers, they went on vacations by the lake, and they went to dances. They had friends both within the Jewish community and also Christian friends as well. They'd invite Christians over to their home for holidays, and they would also be invited to their Christian friends' homes for their holidays as well. My grandfather's city, Piotrkow, was actually on the border of Poland. I like to share a map just because the borders look a little bit different today than they did back then. So I've marked it with a star here. And it was about an hour to 2 hours to Germany. Growing up, my grandfather said that there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism. For the most part, the two communities in Piotrkow got along pretty well. However, he did say occasionally as a child, he would be teased on his way to school, called a dirty Jew. But things slowly started to change throughout the 1930s. He remembers Poles in Piotrkow Trybunalski boycotting Jewish-owned businesses, standing outside of them, picketing, telling other Poles not to do business there. And then very concerning incidents started to happen in the late 1930s. Groups of strangers started passing through Piotrkow Trybunalski. One day they stopped at our family's bakery, asking if there was any food that they could spare. His grandfather, who spoke fluent German, asked them, "What are you doing here? Why are you speaking German?" And they explained that they were Polish citizens who had permanent residency in Germany. But because they were Jews, the Nazi government had stripped them of their permanent residency, moved them from their houses, loaded them onto trains, and basically dropped them off at the border with Poland and said, "Good luck." And these people were now trying to make their way home to the cities, towns, and villages where they came from. Some of these people had been living in Germany since they were small children and didn't even speak Polish. That's when the family knew something serious was going on. In September 1939, when my grandfather was 18 years old, his life changed forever. On September 1st, Germany declared war on Poland and invaded. 4 days later, on September 5th, they reached Piotrkow Trybunalski. It started with a blitzkrieg. German bombers flew over the city and started carpet bombing the entire city indiscriminately. It didn't matter if it was a residential building, a house, a hospital, a church, a synagogue. Because the situation was so dangerous, his father took the children out of the city and sent them to a small village where they stayed with family friends. Once the bombing stopped, his father came and collected them and brought them back to Piotrkow. However, instead of going home, they hid in a castle in the city because there was intense fighting between the Polish and the German armies. Once the fighting subsided, my grandfather's family made their way back to their apartment building, and they were now effectively in German-occupied Poland. About a month later, in October of 1939, the Jewish community was told that they needed to register with the central office in Piotrkow as Jews. They were given passports, had to take photos like this, and they were given Stars of David, just like this, and were told that they had to wear it on their clothing whenever they were outside of their homes upon penalty of death. A few weeks after that, the German administration of the city informed all the Jews that they would be forced to live in a small area within the city. And that was the founding of the Piotrkow Trybunalski Ghetto, the first ghetto established during World War II. This didn't actually affect my grandfather's family too much because their apartment building was already within the designated area, so they didn't have to move. However, waves of refugees started entering the ghetto, Jews that lived outside of the designated area. They also started collecting Jews in the suburbs of Piotrkow and the villages and moving them into this area. Eventually, at its height, they believed there was about 28,000 people in the Piotrkow Trybunalski Ghetto, an area that was meant to house 6,000. Because of this, my grandfather's family had to give up rooms in their own apartment to other families. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, and they had to give each room to a new family, and his family lived in the living room and the kitchen. The family was very fortunate because they were allowed to keep their bakery in operation. At this time, the Germans were repossessing Jewish-owned businesses, closing them down, but they were given special permission to keep the bakery open. And because of that, his father was able to smuggle in extra food and feed the family, as well as their extended family and friends. At that time, the rations were very restrictive, especially for Jews. I believe they subsided on a diet of about 1,000 to 1,500 calories. So it was really difficult to survive off of that. There was a lot of disease in the ghetto, and my grandfather's grandfather, Szyja Kenigsztajn, passed away from disease. At the time, the Germans were also taking away young Jewish men and boys for forced labor projects on a daily basis. Sometimes these people would be taken away for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and sometimes they never returned. One day, my grandfather's older brother, Sewek, was taken off the street, and they never saw him again. Even though things were really difficult in the ghetto, they tried to find happiness and celebration where they could. His younger sister, Franca, actually got married during the ghetto. She met a Jewish police officer named Szyja Kenigsztajn, and they had a big wedding. My grandfather's family hired a car, an automobile, to bring her to the synagogue. They also scraped together what rations they could to make a wedding cake for her. In September of 1942, they were told that the Jewish inhabitants of Piotrkow were going to be relocated. When the day arrived, it was chaos. A lot of shootings on the streets, Germans going into buildings and dragging people out. They eventually got to my grandfather's building and told the family it was time to go. They escorted them down to the pavement outside. At this time, my grandfather's grandmother had been living with them since her husband had died earlier. She was in a wheelchair, so they carried her down the stairs onto the sidewalk. Once they got down there, a German officer asked, "Can she walk?" And they said, "No, she can't walk. She's wheelchair bound, but it's okay, we'll push her." And he said, "You're not going to push her." And he walked over and wheeled her away, and he shot her in front of the family. They then told the family to continue walking, and they led them to a field across from the synagogue. When they got there, there was a long line of people with Germans at the front of the line, directing people either to the right or to the left. By the time my grandfather's family got there, they directed my grandfather, his father, and his younger sister, Franca, to the right. His mother, Gitla, and his older sister, Hannah, were sent to the left. That was the last time he saw them. They, along with 20,000 other Jews from Piotrkow, were loaded into cattle cars, 150 people to a car, no food, no water, and they were transported to the extermination camp, Treblinka, where they were most likely gassed to death in gas chambers a few hours after they arrived. At this point, there were about 3,500 Jews left, and they were relocated to a smaller area within the ghetto, and they were assigned job duties at forced labor camps. My grandfather and his father worked at the Buchenwald wood factory, where they made plywood for the German army. And his sister Franca worked at a general store where Nazi officers would go in to buy goods and supplies. They were now living in apartment buildings that were like barracks, living with strangers, women in one building, men in the other. One day, my grandfather was home from work and he heard a noise outside of his apartment. He opened the door and saw a young girl running up the stairs with a terrified look on her face. She ran directly to him and he brought her in. And she said, "The officers are chasing me. They're going to kill me." As soon as she said that, he heard noise downstairs and could hear German officers entering the building. He quickly took the young girl and he hid her in a basket of laundry. Eventually, the Germans arrived to his apartment and he let them in, and they started beating him, asking him, "Where is the girl?" He said he didn't know what they were talking about. There was no girl there. They didn't believe him. They started tearing the apartment apart, flipping over mattresses, furniture, but they never touched the basket of laundry. So eventually they gave up and decided the girl wasn't there after all, and they left. Once the coast was clear, he took her out of the laundry, and he said, I live with strangers. I don't trust the men that live here. I don't know them. They could sell you out for a piece of bread. You have to go now. There's nothing else I can do for you. And he sent her on her way. And last he saw, she was running through the backyard of the apartment. Shortly after that, his brother-in-law, Szymek, who was married to his sister, Franka, was murdered. He, as I mentioned before, he was part of the Jewish police, which have historically been seen as collaborators with the Nazis. However, he was actually more of a double agent, working for the Polish and Jewish resistance. He had been smuggling information to them about the Nazis' plans. And he was actually trying to smuggle out 2 boys to join the resistance fighters. And they were all betrayed and murdered by the Nazis. In November of 1944, they were once again told that they were going to be relocated. At this point, there were about 1,000 Jews left in Piotrkow. Once again, they were marched to that field across from the synagogue. The men were separated from the women, and they were loaded onto trains. As the trains were pulling out of the station, the Germans hung a sign that said, Piotrkow ist judenfrei. Piotrkow is free of Jews. Once they left the city limits, the train stopped in a field. They were there for a few hours. My grandfather heard a commotion over by the window. The men of the city were telling him, come here, Sewek, come here. So he and his father made their way over to the window. And when they looked out, they saw Franka, his sister, standing next to the train with a bewildered look on her face. His father looked at her and said, Franka, go, save yourself. She said, I don't want to leave you. I want to help you. And he said, there's nothing you can do for me. My God, I gave the world such beautiful children. Go and live. And so she turned and ran across the field. And last they saw, she was heading towards a farmhouse. The trains eventually did start moving again. And they brought my grandfather and his father to the concentration camp, Buchenwald. My grandfather never talked about what he experienced here. The only thing I ever heard was that it was covered in cockroaches the size of rats, rats the size of dogs, and that he subsisted off of potato peels. Even though he didn't share what happened here, the Germans were meticulous in documenting their inmates. These are actual photocopies of the paperwork that they processed when my grandfather arrived. It says that he arrived on December 2nd, 1944, and he was given the inmate number 94954. And the reason he was being incarcerated is a political crime of being born a Polish Jew. They even included his height, his weight, the color of his hair, the color of his eyes, the shape of his nose, the shape of his face, the fact that he had 2 teeth missing. They had a document labeling what items of clothing he was given. And then in the top right-hand corner here, there's a card that says he was relocated to a subcamp called Schlieben 6 days after he arrived in Buchenwald on December 8th, 1944. When I researched Schlieben, I read that they were responsible for building grenades for the German army. So I assume that while he was there, he was part of that manufacturing process. In April of 1944, he was relocated to the concentration camp Theresienstadt, located in what's today the Czech Republic. And he was there for about a month. And then on May 8th, 1945, he was liberated by the Red Army. This is a photo of my grandfather about 6 weeks after he was liberated. He left Theresienstadt and set off on foot to head back to Piotrkow Trybunalski. The journey took about 17 days. In the evenings, he would sleep under bombed out trucks and bombed out trains. And he subsisted off of loaves of bread, some canned food that the Red Army soldiers would throw to him as he was making his journey home. When he arrived to Piotrkow, there was a Polish family living in the apartment. And they told him, don't even think about calling the police. They're killing the Jews that are returning here. So he didn't. However, he was shortly reunited with his sister, Franka. She survived. So if you remember, when we last saw her, she was running across the field, but she made her way back to Piotrkow Trybunalski and went to family friends, Christian Poles, who took her in. At great risk to themselves, if they had been caught by the Germans, they would have all been murdered and possibly even their neighbors. But they took her in, they hid her until she could get in touch with the Polish resistance, who gave her false papers. And she effectively lived under false documentation for the remainder of the war. Sadly, they did learn that their father Haskell didn't survive. He was on a death march from Buchenwald as the Americans were approaching. And one day before those inmates on that death march were liberated, he was shot by the Germans. So out of a family of 6, my grandfather and his sister were the only 2 to survive. And that's not including the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins. Fearing for their safety, they left Poland and registered as stateless refugees. And they were brought to Munich, Germany. Franka got remarried and she had a daughter in Munich. And they built a community with other Holocaust survivors, all the while waiting for a country to take them in. The plan was to move to Australia. And while they were waiting for paperwork, my grandfather was actually arrested, smuggling goods between Germany and Czechoslovakia. At that time, there was an Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and no goods were able to go between Eastern and Western Europe. So he was arrested by the US Army and put in prison. And unfortunately, he missed the cutoff to file his paperwork for his Australian visa. So Franka had to go to Australia with her family and leave him behind. But when he was in prison, he befriended a Jewish army officer who said he would sponsor my grandfather if he wanted to move to the United States. And so in 1951, my grandfather immigrated to the United States through the AJDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And just like immigrants today, he had to take English lessons, lessons on the culture and society of the United States, and an oath of allegiance. Shortly after arriving here, he was given work in Worcester, Massachusetts. So he moved up there and began working in a shoe factory. And it was there that he met my grandmother, Betty, at a dance for Jewish singles. She lived in Boston. Shortly after that, they got married and he moved to Boston. He became a baker, just like his father and his grandfather. They had 3 children, my father and my 2 aunts. He built a life for himself. He had 6 grandchildren, and today he has 4 great-grandchildren. He kept in touch with his sister Franka in Australia. That's actually her on the bottom right. She would visit us in America occasionally, and we also went to visit her and her family in Australia a few times as well. Now, before I end, I just wanted to share one more story with you. In 2009, one of my cousins in Australia had reached out to me to ask if I would deliver a package to some family friends of her mother's that lived in Queens, in Kew Gardens. I was living in Manhattan at the time, so I said, sure, not a problem. When I arrived in their house, the woman here, her name is Guta, had a huge lunch prepared for me. And I said, you didn't have to go to all this trouble. And she looked at me and she said, I wanted to thank you. I didn't know what she meant. I said, it was really no trouble to bring the package. It was my pleasure. And she said, no, that's not why I wanted to thank you. You see, when I was a little girl, I was discovered hiding by the Nazis. And I started running, and they were chasing me, trying to kill me. And your grandfather hid me in a basket of laundry, and he saved my life. My grandfather never actually told me that story. It was Guta who told me. Shortly after that, I asked him, Grandpa, why didn't you ever say anything about that? And he looked at me and he shrugged and he said, what was there to say? I tried to do what I could. Maybe it was enough, maybe it wasn't. And that's the kind of person that he was. He was never boastful, never proud. He just tried to do the right thing and help others where he could. And I try to be the same way. Thank you very much for listening.
Jared, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. That was really incredible. I had to blow my nose off camera at the end there. That was beautiful. We're now going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question for Jared, please type it into the Q&A and we're going to do our best to get to it. But if we don't get to your question, please email info@3gnewyork.org and we will relay it to Jared and he'll be able to answer your question. And that email is in the chat right now. So first, I think we need to ask you, what is it like speaking in schools and what kind of questions do you get asked by students when you tell this story?
Sure, absolutely. So unfortunately, I haven't had a ton of opportunity to present yet because of COVID, but we have finally worked out the kinks and been able to present virtually. So I have reached a few schools now. I get a lot of questions, did he have a tattoo? Does he have any side effects, medical conditions? But what always really surprises me, because I don't talk about this, the high school students ask, I'm sorry this happened to your family and the effects that some of you might still be feeling today. They understand, without me having to say it, that it's not like the Holocaust happened and ended in 1945 and everything was good and everyone went about their lives. They understand that this affects the people, but not just them, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and that there's some sort of intergenerational trauma there. And I'm just so surprised, that these kids are able to pick up on that without even saying it.
Amazing. The next question is about your photos. Folks are wondering how you got them all.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate that my grandfather and his sister did have a lot of photos. So I don't know if it's true, but the story goes that when my grandfather went back home and this family was living in the apartment, they told him to get out. When he left, all their photos and belongings were sitting in the gutter. I don't know if that's actually true because I feel like the elements might have destroyed them. They might have actually hidden them somewhere in the building and he went to get them. But I remember growing up, he had this tattered shoebox and inside it was all these photos from the past. And he only opened it about once or twice because it was hard for him to go through that. But again, when he did, the whole family stopped whatever they were doing and we all just sat and we would watch as he went through each photo.
That's incredible because a lot of families don't have that. Has your grandfather gone back to visit where he's from?
He went back once. I believe it was either 1993 or 1994, right after communism fell in Poland. He brought the whole family. So it was him, my grandmother, my father, his sisters, and my uncle. And he brought them back to Piotrkow Trybunalski, showed them where he grew up, where some of the events took place. It's where we learned about the selection and where he lost his mother and his sister. And then they also went to Theresienstadt, where he was liberated. And they went to some places in Germany as well. Oh, and Treblinka, so he could finally pay respects to his mother and his sister.
Really interesting. Next question is, what happened to your grandfather's brother?
I'm actually really glad that someone asked that. So this is kind of interesting. We were always told that he got picked up off the street, and they believed that he was sent to Skarżysko, which is another labor camp where he died. This weekend, I was doing a little bit of research, which I normally do before I'm about to present, just to make sure I have everything, factually correct. If there's any new information I might want to add. And while I was doing that, I stumbled upon this archive called the Erelson Archive, which is basically the German government documenting what happened during the Holocaust. And when I went in the search engine and typed in my grandfather's name, he came up, and I was just re-reviewing a few things. But I noticed underneath it said Israel Kenigsztajn, which was his brother's name. Shrulik was his nickname. And I just happened to click on it, and I found all this documentation. So I don't know what happened when he was picked up off the street, but he eventually ended up in Buchenwald, along with my grandfather and his father. He arrived in January of 1945, and he died there in March of 1945 from sepsis. And it's tough because I don't think they ever knew that he was there or where he ended up. And it's so heartbreaking to know that all three of them were there at the same time and they didn't even know. But I'm glad that at least someone in our family knows where he ended up now, so that we can pay respects.
The next question is, how did your grandfather's sister escape from the train?
Yeah, so I get that story a lot. So this was documented. This is exactly what happened. So they were all sitting in this field outside of the city. I don't know what they were waiting for. And she started banging on the door of the train. Banging, 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 saying, "Let me out, let me out." And a German officer approached and he opened the door and he said, "What do you want?" And she said, "I want to get out, get me out of here." And so he said, "All right, fine, you want to go? Go." And she jumped off. And then shortly after, her friend, her name was Rena, this officer also let her out as well. And so they actually escaped together. They're, I believe, the only two documented people to ever escape from a train and during the Holocaust.
Amazing. How did you learn this story if your grandfather didn't talk much?
Yeah, so a few stories I did hear from him. For instance, the liquidation of the Piotrkow Trybunalski Ghetto. He did tell us that. Everything before and after the war, I also heard from him. Obviously, we all know the laundry basket story I heard from the young girl. But my grandfather's sister, Franca, she was the exact opposite. She talks about her experiences in the Holocaust all the time. She was part of the Shoah Foundation, Steven Spielberg's foundation that documents and records survivor testimonies. So we have her testimony where she mentions my grandfather a lot. Her son also wrote a biography about her. It's not published, but I have one of the manuscripts. And then this friend, Rena, as well, who escaped the trains with Franca, she knew my grandfather and the family quite well. She lived in Israel. She passed a few years ago. And when we met with her, she also had a lot of stories about my family. For instance, the fact that my great-grandfather used to smuggle in extra food and feed friends and family. She told us that.
The next question asks, were there repercussions back in the ghetto because of the captured 2 boys that tried to escape?
I don't believe so. I didn't hear of anything. But what I do know historically is there were 3,500 people after the liquidation, and about 1,500 were killed. Mass executions were quite common, so it could be. Fortunately, it didn't happen. You know, they didn't come to my family specifically, which obviously they're lucky because Szymek was a relative.
The next question is, did your grandfather ever know the girl from the laundry basket survived and also moved to the US before he passed away?
I think he knew. So her husband is also from Piotrkow, and he ran an organization for the survivors of Piotrkow, and there was a monthly publication. So I'm assuming that he did know she survived and that she was married to this man, because I remember, gosh, my whole childhood, I remember a copy of this newspaper always sitting on his kitchen table.
As far as all the documents and photos, you mentioned how you got the photos, and how you got the documents for your grandfather's brother, but the rest of the documents, were they also from this German database or elsewhere?
No, so, well, they are there, they're housed in that database, but I actually got them from Yad Vashem. My father and I went a few years ago, and they had collected a lot of information on my grandfather and shared it with them.
Next question, what is the background of the kids with the perceptive question?
High school students, just regular public school high school students, but I'm so shocked that they can understand that, you know, these traumas they really impact people for a lifetime, and it can be passed down. And I'm so glad that they have that empathy, because that's really why I try to tell this story, right? Is I want people to understand what the consequences are if we just let hatred keep going unchecked, and that it doesn't just, you know, resolve once the conflict is over. And it's so important, I think, that young students learn these lessons.
Absolutely. Did your grandfather tell his story to your grandmother?
She didn't like to talk about it. So my grandmother was American. So obviously not as affected, although she was still a Jew living in the 1940s, and I'm sure it was difficult. But I almost feel like she was more uncomfortable talking about what happened. So I'm not sure. She, you know, people from that generation tended to not ask questions about things like that. Traumatic situations were kind of taboo. So I'm not sure, but she did obviously go on the trip to Europe, so she would have heard his stories then.
Was your grandpa a physically imposing man? I'm guessing he had to be incredibly strong in every way.
Ooh, okay, this is kind of tough. So my grandfather was a very loving man, but he was very stoic. Didn't show a lot of emotion. And I don't know if growing up, I didn't know if that was just him being from Eastern Europe, right? Where people don't tend to be as emotional as Americans do. However, towards the end of his life, he suffered from dementia. And I remember at my cousin's bar mitzvah, his grandparents came over. I walked in with my grandfather, and my cousin's grandparents from his other side of the family came over, and they said, "Sewek, Mazel Tov." And my grandfather broke down crying, like just broke down. And I've never seen anything like that. I was so uncomfortable. And he said, "I wish my parents were here." And I mean, at this point, my grandfather was in his late 80s, probably late 80s. So at first I'm like, well, your parents wouldn't be here even if the Holocaust hadn't happened. But then later that night, I realized that with, every celebration, every birthday, every bar mitzvah, every wedding, every birth, in the back of his mind, he was thinking, I wish my family was here. And for all those years, he had put up this wall. And in his older age, when he was suffering from dementia, he just didn't have the strength to keep that wall up. And that was a really tough day. I just realized they were always there with him, like with everything that we were doing. He was sitting there thinking, like, I wish my family was here.
Absolutely. And what about physically? Was he a physically strong person, imposing person?
Not really. I'd say he was probably average height, average build. I mean, he was never heavy. I wouldn't consider him muscular. No.
Got it. We're going to close out with this last question. Have you been able to keep in contact with the lady from the laundry basket?
I did see them a few times after that one fateful day, and keep in touch with them. Unfortunately, they both passed. That was over 10 years ago, but I did keep in touch with them. They're an amazing couple. I really liked them a lot.
That's amazing. Jared, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight and for sharing your grandfather's story. And Jackie, thank you for being a part of our program. And thanks again to all of you for joining us. By listening to Jared, you have helped ensure that the memory of his grandfather continues to live on. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat for ways you can donate. Also, if you have any connections with educators who may want to speak, who may want speakers to present to their classes, please reach out. We have a large speaker bureau ready to present either in person or virtually, just like you saw Jared do tonight. We have a couple events and announcements, and we hope to see you again soon. Now through May 21st, we are hosting a virtual film screening of When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. From Academy Award-winning director Carolyn Link comes an adaptation of British author Judith Kerr's novel based on her childhood memories. It's the story of a Jewish family's escape from 1933 Berlin, and it tackles prejudice, exile, displacement, and adaptation as told from the perspective of the author's alter ego, 9-year-old Anna Kemper. 3GNY is also partnered with the J by J Festival to promote the film You Had to Be There. This is a fascinating and life-affirming investigation of the critical role of humor as a coping mechanism during the Holocaust. And this film will be available between May 23rd and May 30th. On Sunday, May 23rd, 3GNY will be in conversation with Tamir Goodman, also known as the Jewish Jordan. Tamir is a former pro basketball player and successful entrepreneur, coach, and educator who credits his survivor grandmother for helping him overcome life's obstacles. And we are hosting our next WEDU Wednesday on June 9th, featuring Stacy Seltzer of 3G Philly. We'll be sending out an email tomorrow with details for these events, as well as a link to the recording of tonight's program. You can also check out our past WEDU Wednesday speakers and our other events on our 3GNY YouTube channel. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We are grateful, as always, for your presence and support. Good night.